Steve, 13 years ago you interviewed Irvine Welsh as part of your book, The Repetitive Beat Generation. In that chapter, Irvine Welsh talked about his very complicated relationship with popular culture. What do you think has happened in the last 13 years? Is he still part of popular culture, or is his journey more complex?
Repetitive Beat Generation was a book of interviews and a setting in context about a set of writers that I ironically labelled Repetitive Beat Generation. The most famous of those authors still writing are John King and Irvine Welsh. And Irvine Welsh in particular was always anxious about the way in which he fitted into popular culture. And he certainly reflects on that in the interviews that I did with him. There was actually several interviews which were made into the live interview in Repetitive Beat Generation. He was a soul boy in the 1970s and huge knowledge about all sorts of aspects of popular culture, popular music, sport and so on. He's a big Hibs fan, still is. And one of the things that he was really surprised about was that suddenly train spotting took off. In the early 1990s, like a lot of these writers, like John King, they were part of a kind of lit zine movement. And Repetitive Beat Generation actually traces the origins of that. Rebel Inc., which was the imprint of Canongate Books that published the book in 2000, was initially a lit zine. And people like Irvine wrote for it, and his friend Kevin Williamson edited it. But I think what he was particularly surprised about was the suddenness of the success of Trainspotting, which was his first book. And he was writing basically Trainspotting as his diaries in the 1980s, about 1987, 88, on a Greyhound bus across America. And actually, by the time that it really took off, which was the mid-1990s, he was amazed, because when Trainspotting was first published, it didn't sell very many. It then really did take off, and the film itself by Danny Boyle globalised the whole thing. But he said to me in the interviews that I did for the book that he was actually anxious in the sense that he didn't think some of that kind of work should actually go overground. He was making a lot of money out of it, and he's sustained a great career as a novelist, still doing it. But he actually felt that in some ways the work should have remained underground. He was really surprised at the speed when it did move from underground to overground about that change, and also in some ways the kind of speed of the overground back to underground of a lot of that literature. A lot of the writers that I interviewed for Repetitive Beat Generation fell by the wayside, went back to what they were doing, and didn't sustain careers of literary prowess. The whole point was not about that in the first place. They weren't interested in sustaining sort of Martin Amis type careers. In some ways, Welsh is the exception. John King is probably another one. But Welsh now is still able to produce novels which globalise. His latest novel, which is about to come out pretty soon, called Skag Boys, even in the title, is a kind of nod back to earlier days, to the people he knew in Edinburgh and other cities. But I actually think he is an exception because he's been able to sustain a particular sort of writing. It isn't necessarily just a kind of youth cultural writing. And at the same time, as I interviewed him, he actually said, what I write about is what he called working class culture. He never saw himself as a youth phenomenon or anything like that. That was the overground doing that. That was the mainstream popular culture in terms of publicity and spin, putting him into that particular zone.